Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone for tonight's program for a trip with the traveling librarian to Rome with our host, Jeff Klapes. He is the former
Clips.
former
Yep.
retired head of reference from the Wakefield Public Library. So we'd like to welcome Jeff tonight to Danvers to do a Zoom program about Rome, and he's going to talk about all the sites and everything that's all about it. So Jeff, after you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I think you said there might be a few other people who might straggle in, but
Yes,
I'll
I'll
go
let
ahead
them
and
in
start.
as we go along.
And as since we're a small group, I tend to like to do my programs very informally. So do feel free if you have any questions, you can either unmute and just chime in since we're a small group, or if you would prefer, you can put questions in the chat and I'll in the Zoom chat, and I'll keep an eye on those questions as we go through. And at the end, I'll stick around as long as we need if you have other questions. I also like always to hear if anybody in the group has traveled to Rome. I always like to hear what other people's experiences were, whether we had the same reactions to things, and what your take is on things. So if you've been, do feel free to chime in. But I will get started and share my screen. Let's see, share. There we go. That should look okay. Um, this is a trip that I did just right before COVID hit, actually, so not too long ago. And I am going to first put things on the map. I'm sure you know where Rome is, but this is a trip that I took that also we stayed a few days in Rome, where I've actually been at least 3 or 4 times. This wasn't the first time I'd been to Rome. And we were on our way to Sicily, where we spent about 2 weeks driving around Sicily. But we spent several days in Rome on the way, which made a nice stopover. And so I think what I'm going to show you tonight will be a mix of some of the really popular sites that you have to see when you go to Rome, but also a few things that are just sort of my personal quirky interests, that I think is also kind of nice because I enjoy when traveling. I enjoy seeing things that are not always at the top of the list. But let's talk a little bit about history first. And you probably have heard the old myth about the founding of Rome, which was in 753 BC. And it was founded by the twins, Romulus and Remus, who descended from Aeneas, who was a famous Trojan prince from the Trojan War in Greek history. And he left um, the far east of the Mediterranean, traveled west, ended up in Italy, and founded the city there. Um, the two twins, Romulus and Remus, there was already a local king in the area, and he tried to drown them because that's what people did back then. But they were rescued and rescued by a wolf, a female wolf, a she wolf. And so that's why you see now very often you will see sculptures and iconography that depicts the twins being suckling the she wolf. I'm going to actually show you a good example of that. However, as nice a story as that seems to turn out to be, Romulus then killed his brother, and it's from his name that we get the name of the modern city, Rome. And you probably also have heard of Rome being the city of seven hills. And so here you can kind of see, this is from Google, so you can kind of see the topography. Um, these days, the original seven hills of history are kind of hard to see in the modern city, which has spread far beyond them. And of course, there's a great deal of modern construction on top of the hills. Um, Currently, Rome is the biggest city in Italy, as well as the capital, and it's got about 4 million people in the surrounding area, so it's quite big. But one thing that I enjoy about Rome, traveling there, is that unlike a lot of American cities, it's not full of skyscrapers. It still has a feel of being a very old city. There is some more modern development on the outskirts, but the historic center of the city really still feels very old, which it is, and it feels almost more like a city of many small neighborhoods rather than an enormous, overwhelming modern city like New York or Paris or London or a place like that. Um, the view that you can see on the left was a hotel that we happened to stay in on this trip just for a few nights right near the Vatican, which I'm also going to talk about. Um, and certainly a delight of walking around Rome is to look at the architecture because it's not just ancient Rome. Rome has been an important city for the past 2,000 years, essentially, 2,500 years, um, in fact. And you will see a mix of modern architecture from the 20th century. You'll see a lot of 19th century architecture. You'll see a lot of Renaissance architecture. You'll see Baroque churches. You'll see ancient ruins. And all of these things are layered on top of each other, which I think is a real visual representation of the history of the city. Um, and I'm going to start with the Vatican because we were right next to it. And the Vatican is actually the smallest independent state in the world. It's a country in a sense that it is a sovereign nation, but of course it doesn't have an army and it doesn't have a lot of the things that countries have. But it is still considered a modern nation, and it has only 1,000 people. So there are many villages right here in Massachusetts that are actually considerably larger, and it's only 109 acres. Its independence was established by the Lateran Treaty with the country of Italy in 1929. And of course, the big thing to see there, one of two, is St. Peter's, which is the largest church in the world, has been for quite some time, was built in the late 16th and early 17th century with some contributions by very famous people like Bramante and Bernini, the sculptor, who was also an architect, and Michelangelo, of course, as well, who was not only a sculptor, but also an architect. The dome, which is 450 feet high, is the tallest dome in the world. And the church can hold about 60,000 worshipers. The facade, which you can see very clearly here, is actually one of the least successful parts, I think, of the building. I tend to notice a lot of these things because I was in my undergraduate days many years ago, I was an architecture history student. So I studied a lot of different time periods of architecture. And when I travel, that's one of the things I pay the most attention to. Um, and one of the things that a lot of people don't know about this particular church is that there were supposed to be, like many churches, two big towers, as any cathedral would have, right on the facade on either side. The reason there aren't is because they discovered in the course of construction that the ground underneath was not really strong enough to support towers. So they gave up, and instead, there's the facade that you see right now, which is very neoclassical and kind of hides what ends up being an incredibly dramatic interior. The semicircular facades that you see, or arcades that you see outside the front, create an enormous elliptical plaza, piazza in Italian, which is sort of symbolically represents the embrace of the church, the embrace of the entire world in the arms of the church. And these arcades were designed by Bernini, who is an incredibly famous sculptor. We're going to see some other things of his later. Um, and this whole piazza complex was finished quite a bit later after the church part was finished. And there are 140 saints that ring the top of this arcade, and each one is about between 2 and 3 times life size. They're all about 15 feet high, so much bigger than you'd actually think from the ground. I should point out, if you follow the news at all, this is either a really good year to visit Rome or a really bad year to visit Rome. if you're thinking of going there, because this is a Jubilee year that the Pope decrees. It's a big year of celebration. They have done a lot of, there was construction for the past year or so while they were cleaning things and renovating things, and they expect millions upon millions of visitors, more than there would normally be in Italy, which is a lot. So it makes for a very festive year to be in Rome, with all kinds of activities related to that celebration. But it also means that Rome is going to be far busier, and probably more expensive than it would normally be in a non uh, festival year. So you can kind of, if you're thinking of going, you can weigh the pros and cons of that. This is a view showing some of the back parts of the Vatican, which is a huge complex. The hundred or so acres of land behind also include the papal palaces and the museum, which we're going to see shortly, along with a lot of other buildings related to the running of the church. But it's the interior that really blows you away. This is a church that replaced the one that stood there from the 4th century, very, very early on the site. And it had fallen into disrepair. It was a very old basilica. And so they rebuilt this church with the famous people like Bramante and Michelangelo and so forth. There was another architect named Maderno who was less well known, but they were the primary architects, the figures in the more than a century of design and construction that it took to build the church. And the details, of course, are just stupendous. One of the first things that you'll see on the right as you enter the church is Michelangelo's Pietà, which was sculpted around 1499 and is probably the most famous sculpture in the entire church. There's an interesting story around that because about 50 years or so ago, it was in the early 1970s, a mentally disturbed man attacked it with a hammer, for reasons that I don't think they really know. And he actually did considerable damage to the statue. So now what you wouldn't know unless you looked it up is Mary's nose, which was knocked off during that horrible incident, was actually reconstructed from a piece of stone that came from the back of the statue that you can't see. So it's almost like that kind of surgery where they take skin from one part of your body, do plastic surgery. But so her nose actually can't tell. But the other unfortunate result of this incident is that the Pietà is now very tightly secured behind bulletproof glass, and so you can't get up as close to it as you used to be, which is kind of a shame. But it's still an amazing work of art to see. Every corner of the building is dripping with marble. This is a very Baroque structure. So it's got over the top decorations, gigantic cherubs, like you can see here in the Holy Water Fount, and also numerous tombs of very important figures in the church and in church history. The dome, which is probably the most notable aspect of the building, was worked on by a number of different architects and wasn't completed until about 1590, like a whole century after construction started. And all around the top, can't quite see, but you can see there's a little bit of Latin writing around the edge. And what that says is in Latin, "You are Peter, on this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." And on the right, you will see another thing that was done by Bernini, the sculptor, which is known as the baldacchino. It covers the altar, and it's 95 feet tall, which seems, when you look at it, it just doesn't seem that high. And it's made of bronze. And St. Peter's tomb is supposedly underneath, down in the crypts down below. Well, that's kind of disputed whether that's actually true or not. And in the niches that are in the 4 huge support columns that support the dome on each side are saints that hold relics. This is St. Helena. In one corner, she is holding the true cross. And here's just some examples of a couple of the other tombs that you can see on either side. You could easily spend a good couple of hours just exploring the central nave of the church because there's so much to see. Bernini also did the Throne of St. Peter, which is in the apse in the back. This is not actually the throne of St. Peter. The chair is actually from the 12th century, so it can hardly have been genuine. But it represents his throne in his church. And the window, which is above it, can't really see it on this day very well because we were there on kind of a cloudy day. But it's made of translucent yellow alabaster, which means that if the sun is right, the glow that comes through that is absolutely magical. And it represents the Holy Spirit. This is looking straight up into the dome. All kinds of interesting details to see. I particularly liked this one. This is a much later tomb by a sculptor called Antonio Canova, who was known for doing a lot of Egyptian revival style sculptures. If it weren't for the money, I've always thought I would love to have my own tomb when I die. I want to be a big monumental thing with full size angels weeping over me. But I don't think I have the budget for that. If you want, and if you're not afraid of heights, you can actually go up the dome. This is actually a view from the worst part. If you're afraid of heights, you can see around the edge. See this railing, this teeny little railing, which is made of just metal bars. You can take an elevator. You can take stairs, but there's also an elevator that will get you to this level at the base of the dome. And from there, you have to walk around about half, either a quarter or a half of the church, which gives you incredible views down to the church below. But it's 160 feet, and it's very precipitous. So if you don't like heights, this probably isn't for you. But from there, you can walk 500 more steps into the dome. Here's another view where this is looking towards the altar. But if you do, you can actually come outside on the very top of the dome where there is an absolutely amazing view of the entire city of Rome. So as you can see, the weather wasn't so great, but even on a cloudy and sort of rainy day, it was still incredibly beautiful. And you can see all of the spires and domes of the old city. This is looking across the enormous piazza that I was talking about earlier with the big arcades, and looking down to the Tiber River as it flows through Rome. What you do in order to get up there, is as soon as you pass the really scary bit, the stairs that go to the very top are actually in between the inside and the outside of the dome, which so you're squeezed in between on this stairway that curves up inside between the two, the exterior and the interior of the structure, and then you burst out onto the top where you get this incredible view. This is looking back towards the museum, the Vatican museums that you can see here. And in the other direction, this building here, we're going to see in a little bit. This is the Sistine Chapel, which isn't an actual chapel, of course, but it is now part of the Vatican Museum. So you visit it by going to the museums. You can also walk around on the roof. So when you get to the top of the dome, you're up here, but you can also explore the roof, where there is an amazing view of the backside of all of those enormous statues. These are, again, between 15, 20 feet high, over the front facade of the church with Christ in the center, and 11 of his apostles, plus John the Baptist on either side. The one who isn't there is St. Peter, and that's because he's inside the church. Here we are again. You can kind of see people clustered around the railings at the very top. So I would highly recommend this. It's a highlight of any visit to Rome and of the Vatican, but it really depends on how good you are with heights. Here's just some other photos of the architecture around the front of the Vatican. I like to show food in my presentations too, and you can't visit Rome without the food. This is rolled eggplant antipasto that we just stopped for lunch with fresh basil and chopped up pistachios. Rome has very delicious food, and there is a very uniquely Roman style of cooking. If you know anything about Italian food, you know that Italy has a pretty big variety of regions, each of which has its own style, its own dialect, and definitely its own cuisine. So, although there's an overarching Italian food, um, each particular area has its own specialties, kind of like the United States. And Rome, the area around Rome, is known for a particular style of cooking. Um, you can walk all around the city and see scenes like this. This is one of the major piazzas. Rome has a lot of big public squares, piazzas, that are often connected by grand boulevards. This particular one, the Piazza del Popolo, the Plaza of the People, is a large pedestrian square with these two paired churches. And the road that goes between them, right here, is called the Via del Corso, which is one of the main streets in the city. And it's a very long, straight shopping street, which is significantly pedestrianized, not the whole way, but much of it is pedestrianized, which makes it a really nice place to stroll and shop and have a gelato, stop and have a coffee, and watch the Italians go by, and all the tourists as well. Italians are really nicely dressed. So um, I think if you go there, you have to make an effort to fit in with the Italians. And around virtually every corner, you'll see all kinds of wonderful details like this. These are the Spanish Steps, another very famous site in the city, which is between the Piazza di Spagna, um, the plaza of Spain, and at the base, that's at the base. And if you go up the steps, the church at the top is called Trinità dei Monti, meaning that it's the Church of the Trinity up at the top of the mountain. The Spanish Piazza and the Spanish Steps are so named because the Spanish embassy used to be here. It's the only reason. Back when Italy was ruled by the Bourbon Empire. Um, so that's where it got its name. And these days, the steps are an incredibly popular meeting place, although because it's so over touristed, you might have seen some articles over the past couple of years about how over tourism is really hitting certain parts of Europe, and Rome is one of them. The Spanish Steps, they actually now don't let you sit on the Spanish Steps. You have to keep moving because otherwise it becomes a complete bottleneck. But it's still a lovely place to stroll around. And the area around it has these very typical Italian buildings, most of which were built in like 18th and 19th centuries and have a very, very Italian look. And much of that is due to the style of the buildings, but also the colors. You'll see a lot of very warm colors like the yellows and golds, and also kind of coral colors and uh, buff colors that turn a beautiful, warm gold in the late afternoon when the sun hits them. That's kind of the nicest time to stroll around. Another place that's been hit by over tourism is the Trevi Fountain. And this depicts actually a Greek story. This is the god Okeanos, one of the Greek gods of the ocean. And it's an incredible sculptural assemblage that is about 150 feet wide and 90 feet high. It's very popular with tourists, partly because it's beautiful, but also because of from the movies. And now the name of the movie escapes me, but you know it's very famous. Where if you turn your back and you throw a coin over your shoulder, um, it's it it's an indication that you will at some point go back to Rome. and it's very, very atmospheric. However, the problem with it is that it's in a very narrow space. The plaza around it is actually quite small. So, with enormous numbers of tourists crowding into the area, particularly during the busiest times of year, it's gotten a little out of hand. Um, they've even had difficulty with people filling their water, climbing into the fountain to fill water bottles, which is just amazes me that people think they can do that. Um, People have jumped in, people have climbed on the sculptures. So now, in I think just in this past year, they are introducing timed tickets. So even though it's on a public street, just to keep control of the crowds, you're going to have to actually get a ticket that's timed so that it will control the biggest crowds. And although that's somewhat of an inconvenience, it may actually make the experience much nicer. I don't know if that's something that they're doing all year round, because of course there are parts of the year when Rome doesn't have as massive tourist crowds. So it may be that they're only going to be doing it during the busy summer months. But if you are traveling there, that's something I would look into ahead of time. Um, the fountain, because of everybody throwing coins in the fountain, they collect about 3,000 euros a day that are collected from from the base of the pool, and those are donated to Catholic charities throughout the city. But you can see in this image just how it's, and this isn't even that busy a day. It gets just completely out of control. But as touristy as it is, it's touristy for a reason. It's an unbelievable set of sculptures. Something that not that many people visit is the National Monument to Victor Emmanuel II. Um, he was the first king after the unification of Italy. This was finished in 1925. It's not an ancient building by any means. And inside there's a museum about the history of the unification of Italy, and also the tomb of their unknown soldier. But even if you don't go inside, there's a very nice view. You can kind of see up here. There's um, a little kiosk or something up at the top, and there is an amazing view from up there if you want to go get a view over much of the Roman Forum and the downtown area. It's known as rather unaffectionately as Mussolini's typewriter, because that's the time period when it was built, and it does. Once you look at it, it does actually kind of remind you of an old typewriter. It has a sort of wedding cake over the top style to it, but it still is quite impressive. Very close by is Trajan's Column. This is 115 feet high, and this commemorates the victory of the Emperor Trajan in the Dacian Wars, which took place in Romania in the beginning of about the second century. There is a spiral staircase inside that allows you to get all the way to the top. And if you were to unroll the frieze that goes, you can see this sculptural frieze that goes around it. Um, if you unwind that, it's going to be about 600 feet long. And it actually, they have done that. There is a museum on the outskirts of the modern city where you can actually see the entire thing at eye level, and it depicts Trajan's campaigns. You can see the column here, and it's in between some things that are much later. This is Trajan's Forum, which is from his time period, about the early second century AD. But the churches in behind, these twin domes, are from two Baroque churches from much later in the 18th century. It's another good example of all the different layers in Rome. Um, One of my favorite museums in Rome is on the Capitoline Hill. This was one of the seven hills of Rome, and it was redesigned by Michelangelo in the 1500s, and now has a couple of very important museums in the city, along with a monumental stairway that Michelangelo designed that takes you up to the plaza in between the buildings. Here you can see some old and some new. This is uh, the mythological image that I was talking about, where the she wolf is suckling the twins Romulus and Remus. And here's a stylish Italian woman walking around the museums. Right behind this hill is the Forum, the Roman Forum, which is one of several fora in the city, but by far this is the biggest and the most famous. And there's quite a few sites here to see, a number of ancient temples right from uh, right around the first couple of centuries AD. This is the temple of Antoninus and Faustina, which was built by Antoninus for his deceased wife, but they later named it for both of them. And what you can sort of see here, it's an ancient temple, but inside there's a church that was built much later. And they built it inside the columns. You could spend easily an entire day exploring the Forum. There are countless temples. There's a lot of areas that people don't really get to up on the hills where you can explore old palaces of the emperors with the remains of their gardens, endless temples and arches. These are the temples, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which is on the left, 500 BC. So that's about the time period of the height of ancient Greece back in Athens. And on the right is the House of the Vestal Virgins from about the same time. Vesta was the Roman goddess of the hearth, and there was a cult of women who served the goddess in her temple. And here's a view, kind of a general view looking out from the Capitoline Hill. You can see all the way through the Forum. And way off in the distance is the Colosseum, another of Rome's biggest sites. Looking in the opposite direction, the Capitoline Hill with its museums are here. Mussolini's typewriter, this is the backside of it. And you can see also the arch right here of Septimius Severus. And the blocky building that you can kind of see in the center right over here, this is the old Senate building. It's known as the Curia and was built in the year 44 by Julius Caesar. And it is one of the few buildings in the Forum that has survived mostly intact and mostly unaltered from its original appearance when it was built. Here's another sort of general view out over that whole area, looking towards Trajan's Column and the churches. And looking back towards the dome of the Vatican, way off in the distance, that's St. Peter's. The Basilica of Maxentius, which is probably the biggest building in the Forum, built in the 300s AD. It is at this point, it's the largest remaining structure in the Forum. It was a court, like a legal court, and it was also served as a meeting place, meeting hall. It also had an enormous statue of Constantine, and the statue is long gone, but bits and pieces of it, including a foot and his head and I think an arm, are on display in the Capitoline museums at the top of the hill at the other end of the Forum. And the Palatine Hill, which is on the opposite side on the sort of west side of the Forum, one of the original 7 hills, includes the Palace of Domitian, yet another emperor. And he was emperor in about the 1st century AD. And the complex is enormous. And you could spend a couple hours just walking around this part. And of course, there are great views from up there as well. Down below, this is the Arch of Titus, built in the year 82, also by Domitian. But Domitian was Titus's brother, so this arch is basically honoring his brother's military victories. And the Church of St. Francis, which is much later, from the 10th century, although the facade that you can see here was added even later in the 1600s. So that's why it's a much more Baroque style, Renaissance style. The Colosseum is certainly one of the most touristy sites in all of Rome, but you kind of need to go see it. Even if you don't go inside, you have to see the exterior just because It's so monumental. It is the largest such Colosseum. There's a number of them in the Roman world, some in North Africa, some in France, some in Spain. But the one in Rome is the largest one that still exists today, and it was built under Titus and also under Vespasian and could hold 80,000 people, easily competing with any modern football stadium in the United States today. It's 600 feet long, 500 feet wide, and 160 feet high. You can just walk around the outside and get a feel for it. Um, I hate to say skip the inside. The problem is it's kind of expensive, and if you don't want to wait, I think you could probably miss the inside. But it's worth it definitely to walk around and get a sense of just how monumental this structure is. Um, I also just like seeing Rome because it's a shopper's paradise. Certainly, if you like shoes and fashion and leather. Um, but if you happen to be a priest, there are stores where you can buy stuff that's necessary for any good priest to have. Another building that's one of the oldest in the city is the Pantheon. This was built in the early second century by Hadrian and by Trajan. And the inscription at the top here refers to Agrippa, who built the previous building on this site, but it burned. And except for the front that you see here, the rest of the building was destroyed. But they saved the front and built this absolutely perfect dome. It is famous for its oculus, which is the open hole uh, in the top of the dome. It is still to this day the world's largest unreinforced dome. It's only made by ancient concrete. There is no steel or any other structure in there to hold it up. And this is to give you an idea of the architectural design of the structure. The interior, the dome, and if it were to extend all the way to the floor, would fit a perfect sphere, 142 feet in diameter. The little hole at the top, the oculus, is actually 30 feet across. It's quite large. And it's an incredibly impressive building. It was converted to a church, a Catholic church in the 7th century. And now it is the whole idea of a pantheon is that it is where the most famous people, it means many gods, but in this context, it refers to famous people in the culture, in the history of Italy. And so many of them are now buried here, including here's Victor Emmanuel's tomb, along with a number of other famous people. Um, a lovely square that is a good place to get something to eat is Piazza Navona. That was built on the site of a stadium. If you look at it from above, this plaza actually is a very long, skinny um, plaza with a semicircle at one end. And that shape is because of the fact that in ancient Rome, it was actually a stadium. And now it has been centuries later, the stadium disappeared. All kinds of other Baroque and Renaissance buildings like churches were built around it, and now it's a pedestrian space. But it has a couple of very famous fountains by Bernini. We're going to talk continually about Bernini because he's one of the most famous Italian sculptors ever in all of history. This particular one, the largest in the square, is from the 1650s, and it's called the Fountain of the Four Rivers. Four of what at the time, back in the 1600s, were considered four of the world's major rivers, and each sculpture represents a human representation of those rivers. So I forget which ones they were, but I think it was the Danube, the Nile, the Volga. I'm forgetting now, but it's quite an impressive sculpture. There's a number of churches here that people whiz by very quickly, which is too bad because they're very beautiful. This is a 17th century Baroque church called Saint Agnes. And another one that people tend to walk by just around the corner is San Luigi dei Francesi, also from the 16th century, which has a very famous chapel with a cycle of three paintings. Here you can see two here by Caravaggio. I love Rome as someone who studied art history because you almost literally cannot walk down any street in Rome without passing a church or a museum or something that has something unbelievably famous in it. And you could easily just walk by and not know it was there. This church, not that many people bother to go in. But if you do, it's, first of all, it's incredibly beautiful over the top with all of these Baroque decorations. But this huge chapel has three very large paintings by Caravaggio. One is the Calling of St. Matthew, the Inspiration of St. Matthew, and the Martyrdom of St. Matthew. And they're kind of in their own chapel, beautifully lit. Back to the 21st century, I just loved this very stylish shoe store. This was on the Via del Corso, I think. And nighttime, of course, is an amazing time to explore Rome. This is the sun setting over the Tiber River, looking west towards the Dome of the Vatican. And here's the Vatican at night, St. Peter's. One thing that is another kind of top 10 thing to do in Rome, but it's getting more and more frustrating, is the Vatican museums. They have probably one of the most impressive art collections on the planet. But because of that, they are unbelievably busy, and lines start forming around the building a good 2 or 3 hours before they open. And they now use a number of systems where you can skip the line by paying a special price to get in, and you can go for evening tours and so forth. But my problem with it when we were there last was that no matter how you visited, it was so overcrowded. They just let too many people in at once. And nonetheless, although you might be frustrated, it's one of the world's great museums, and it's hard not to go. Um, it I thought I had a picture of the lines. I might. Anyway, this is the entrance to the museums. The collections in the museum were accumulated over many centuries by the popes, but they started in about the early 16th century. And most of what they've collected, the collections are mostly strong in Roman sculptures, many of which are copies of earlier Greek sculptures, a lot of stuff from the Renaissance, an enormous collection of manuscripts, and the highlight, of course, is the Sistine Chapel. If you manage to get into the museum, skip everything and make a beeline as fast as you can go to the Sistine Chapel, because if you do that, you might have 15 minutes in the chapel before the crowds get there. It really is kind of insane. It's like going to Disney World and running to the most popular rides. But it also has some of the most famous sculptures anywhere. This is Laocoon and his sons. This was the very first item that established the museum back in the 1500s. It is probably a copy of an earlier Greek work. The story for this is from the Trojan War. Laocoon was a Trojan priest, and he tried to warn the Trojans when the Greeks brought the Trojan horse inside the walls. Laocoon didn't trust it and tried to warn the Trojans that this was a trick. But Athena, the goddess Athena, who sided with the Greeks, was unhappy with him telling them this. So she sent a serpent to kill him and his two sons. So the serpent came out of the ocean, swallowed up the three of them, and that was that. So this sculpture depicts that. You can see the serpent tangled around their legs, but it's one of the world's most unbelievable marble works of art. And here's another one. This is a Roman copy of a Greek original showing a Greek athlete. Um, you can't see it because parts of him have disappeared at this point, but he's using a tool called existra, which would have scraped the oil. Greek Greek athletes would have oiled themselves in the course of their athletic endeavors, and afterwards they scraped the oil off with a special metal tool. This one is Artemis of Ephesus, not the Artemis of Greece, a different version of her worshipped in Asia Minor. You can probably guess from this that she was a fertility goddess. They have an enormous collection of heads of various famous people throughout history. The buildings themselves are incredible, especially. I think I have a couple of other pictures coming up. There's a section, a very long hall that has frescoes of different important battles throughout Italian history. On the right is the Apollo Belvedere, which is another one of the most famous ancient sculptures. They have some Egyptian works as well, like you see here. One of many ancient tombs, sarcophagus, tapestries. And this is the long hall. This map gallery is 400 feet long, was commissioned by Pope Gregory VIII in the late 16th century. And the frescoes that you can kind of see along the side show that these, like I just mentioned, these are topographical maps of different parts of Italy, often showing battles that took place there. And the ceiling is just just incredible. Uh, Here's a close up of one of the maps. Um, and the incredible detail. This is not painted. This is actual um, marble and plaster sculpture that's been painted in gilt. It's just mind blowing. There's also a section of paintings by Raphael. This is his famous School of Athens. It's a fresco, part of a series of rooms as you get close to the Sistine Chapel. Raphael decorated a whole series of these smaller rooms. This is one of his most famous, depicting sort of imaginary classical landscape, but with all of the famous philosophers of Greek history, ancient history. There's also a gift shop. So when you go to the gift shop, you can buy postcards and you can buy art replicas and you can buy beautiful books of all the art, and you can buy little plastic Pope mobiles also if you want. This is the more modern entrance, very close to the main entrance to the museum. This is called the Bramante staircase, which was built in the 1930s. And it's a double helix ramp. That's the kind of staircase where this is looking down. It's named after Bramante, who was one of the main architects of St. Peter's. And he also designed a similar kind of staircase in another part of the Vatican back in the 1500s. But the idea behind a double helix is there are actually two stairways nested within each other so that someone can go up and someone else can go down and they will never meet each other. But it's in the very entrance to the museum. Here's the Sistine Chapel, which technically you are not allowed to take photographs in, so I sneaked this one with my phone. It is named for Pope Sixtus the Fourth, and in the late 1400s, he oversaw the renovation of this part of the church, and he hired um, uh, famous painters like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio, who did works on the walls. And then later, in the early 1500s, under the Emperor Julius II, or sorry, Pope Julius II, um, he invited Michelangelo to come in to paint a monumental Last Judgment against the back wall. And then, of course, the ceilings. There was a controversial restoration that was done. I was going to say recently, but it's been about 30 years at this point. Many centuries of candle wax and Other kinds of pollution had significantly darkened the frescoes, and there was a very long process where they restored them to their original bright colors, which is just quite stunning. You can actually see Adam and Eve here with the serpent around the tree. But as I mentioned earlier, if you go fast, because the second you get into the museum, skip everything else and run to the Sistine Chapel, see it first, and then spend your time looking at everything else. Let's have a snack. This is just a nice antipasto plate, which Italy is famous for. Um, Good olives, some eggplant, fried. I love fried peppers. And I forget what those little, I think they were like little cheese tostadas or something. Really, really good. A church that not everybody bothers to go to, but it's major. This is one of the four major papal basilicas, the others being St. Peter's, one called St. Paul's outside the walls, and the fourth is Santa Maria Maggiore. Those four churches are technically not Italian territory, just like the Vatican. They are considered Vatican territory, so not Italy. They are these little pieces of the Vatican in other parts of the city. And St. John Lateran goes back to the fourth century A.D. and was in fact the first church in the city of Rome, first Catholic church in the city of Rome, Christian church. The current building obviously is from much later. This is from the 18th century. And it's very impressive on the interior. The doors, which were bronze and designed by a sculptor called Borromini, who also designed much of the rest of the building. Um, the surrounding of the doors was designed by Borromini. The doors themselves, the actual bronze doors, are from the Curia. And if you remember, that's the building I mentioned in the forum, the one that was kind of boxy and boring looking, but had not really changed since its original construction. These were the original bronze doors from that building, and they were moved to this church. And you can see the interior that has a spectacular gilt ceiling, and also a dome over the crossing, and some amazing statues of the apostles. It has its own baldacchino, just like the one in St. Peter's, although this one has a more Gothic style to it. Supposedly, up here in the top, it contains the heads of Saints Peter and Paul. The likelihood of that being true is really probably not the case. But it's a story, and they're sticking to it. Some other views of the inside of the church. Um, and I have to show you probably this is, I think I would have to say this is my favorite place in all of Rome. And anytime I go to Rome, I would have to make a pilgrimage to this particular museum. It's called the Galleria Borghese. It is actually, it's not off the beaten path. It's a well-known museum in the city. And the Borghese family um, built it as a villa, and it is surrounded by the original gardens. This is the villa from the outside. When it was first built back in the early 1600s by the head of the family, he was a cardinal, Cardinal Borghese. At the time, this was actually very much on the outskirts of the city, in the countryside, almost the suburbs of the city. And so, in this enormous park in the lands that they owned, he built this beautiful country villa. Um, it has outbuildings like this casino, which was used as an aviary where they raised birds, pigeons, and things for the kitchens. But it is now one of Rome's best art museums. The interior of the building is fantastic, even if it did not have any art in it. It's got about 20 rooms, and the decor is just, it blows your mind. But an interesting thing about the building, because the Borghese family was very influential art patrons and art collectors. A number of the most famous pieces that are in the museum today in the house that they built were actually designed for that space. They were commissioned specifically to be placed in this building where they live today. And I mentioned Antonio Canova earlier. These are actually much later because he was an 18th and 19th century sculptor. He's the one who, in the Vatican, I showed you a very Egyptian style tomb, and he was a well-known sculptor at the late 18th and early 19th century. But this work of his is Pauline Bonaparte. She was Napoleon's sister. It's a very well-known sculpture. But the highlights of this museum and the ones that I get the most excited about are some of Bernini's most famous works. Bernini was only in his early 20s when he was commissioned by the Borghese family to do several works for them. This would have been the early 1600s. This is David, as in David and Goliath, which was a life-size sculpture done around 1623. And you can see it kind of, you can feel the twisting. It catches him right at the moment that he's about to release the slingshot that sends a stone towards Goliath. Another one that's absolutely spectacular is Apollo and Daphne, which is a complete tour de force in stone. This is depicting the Greek god Apollo, who was pursuing Daphne because she was a nymph. And he fell in love with her and pursued her because of an arrow by Eros. And she prayed to her father, who was a god. He was a river god. And so he was able to turn her in order to protect her from Apollo's advances. He turned her into a laurel tree, a bay tree, like where you get bay leaves from. And this depicts Apollo and as he's reaching at Daphne. But take a look at the incredible detail here. These leaves, you can see her fingers. I can actually show you even something closer. Here are her toes. These are life size. Her toes are developing roots. Leaves are sprouting from her fingers. It catches her right at the moment that she's transforming into a laurel tree. Daphne, interestingly, is the Greek word for that kind of tree. And to think that this was all carved from a single block of marble by a guy who was in his 20s is kind of, I just can't wrap my head around it. This is the back where you can see this is Apollo and the fabric that he's wearing, and a close-up of the leaves, and you can see even the berries of the bay tree. The main hall, this gallery, houses probably the most famous work, which is the Rape of Proserpina by Pluto. Or if you do the Greek version, it's Hades, the god of the underworld, abducting Persephone. Same story, different names, depending on whether you're talking about Greek or Roman gods. In the Greek story, she was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. And the ground opened up. The god Hades decided he was in love with her. He had to have her. He opened the ground up. His chariot came up and took her down into the underworld. Demeter, her mother, goddess of agriculture, searched for her all over the place, could not find her. And of course, while Demeter was distracted and unable to find her daughter, crops failed, everything turned to winter, the season stopped turning. And you know the end of the story. Hades eventually agreed to return her. But Persephone made a mistake. She ate some pomegranate seeds while she was in the underworld. And if you do that, that means you have to return. So that's why she is now required to spend 1/3 of each year in the underworld with Hades and the other 2/3 of the year up above. And so that's the ancient Greek mythology that explains to them the origin of the seasons. But the sculpture is like nothing you've ever seen before. This is a close up of his hand. And again, as a reminder, this is marble, this is stone. It is similar to the other two works that I just showed you in that there's a very spiral sense of movement in the figures. And these are a bit larger than life size. But the detail of the muscles, the details in the hands, the fingernails, the pressure of his hands onto her thigh, it's just every time I see these sculptures in person, I actually get choked up because I've never seen art that moves you so much like this. They're just incredible. So I would highly recommend uh, if you go to Rome, uh, put this high on your list. It's just one of the most beautiful museums in the entire city. It has a bunch of other stuff too. It even has some Caravaggios there. It has this very weird anonymous sculpture from the 17th century of three cherubs sleeping on a dinner plate. I don't know. Um, and some other very important works. These two are Caravaggios, both around the first decade of the 1600s. One is David holding the head of Goliath, and also St. John the Baptist as a young teenager. This photograph. And I think this is the last one I'll show you. This tiny little church, this is another one that people often skip. From the outside, it's a very unassuming church. And it's called Santa Maria della Vittoria. And inside, it has another one of Bernini's masterpieces. This is again the same sculptor I just showed you a couple of minutes ago. This one was done much later in his life, around 1650, towards the end of his life, and it depicts the ecstasy of Saint Teresa of Avila in Spain. And part of what makes it so amazing is not just the sculpture itself, but the setting, because it's in one of the side chapels, and it depicts the Saint Teresa, being pierced by a golden sword. You can see here, or an arrow, rather, by an angel, and it's piercing her with the love of God. But what makes it special is that this little chapel, here's a larger view of the church, and the sculpture is off here on the side. It actually has, it's lit from the exterior. The chapel sticks out a few feet over the street, over the sidewalk, and there is a little window above it that lets natural light in that comes down just like the light that the sculpture is trying to depict again here. So this is natural light coming in from outside. And the whole assemblage was specifically designed to do that. Right outside the church it's this funny plaza that has a very pretty fountain. This is an old Renaissance fountain where back in those days people would actually go to get water in the neighborhood, and now it's completely filled with Italian motorcycles. Oh, I guess I did have one more church to show you. You remember I mentioned the four important Vatican churches. This is another one of them called Santa Maria Maggiore, and it's kind of weird looking from the outside because you can see the church in the middle here, but it's got these big things stuck on the side. It's a very early church to the Virgin Mary, going again back to the 5th century, but obviously what you see here is later. And the wings on either side are for the sacristy and also the church offices. But it has the highest bell tower in all of Rome. And inside, it looks a little bit, it reminds me quite a bit of the St. John Lateran. And it's full of mosaics, some of which are very early, some of which are from more recent centuries. And most of them show Old Testament scenes. You can see them behind the columns and also at the very top. The ceiling is covered with gold. which supposedly was brought back to the from the New World back to Italy by Columbus, they say. And under the baldacchino, again, this is another church with a big baldacchino, is a crypt of the Nativity, where there is a relic um, that is supposedly a piece of wood from the original crib of Christ when he was born. It also happens to be the site of the burial of Saint Jerome, who was the one who originally translated the early Bible into Latin. So he's very well known, and you can see him here. And again, for someone like me who adores Bernini, as you can tell from all the things I showed you, he's buried in this church. He died in 1680. So I, of course, had to make a pilgrimage to see where he is buried. And I'll end here. This is, here we are. We visited a couple of friends who live in Rome. I have a friend who's actually from Bosnia, and his girlfriend, Chiara, who you can see here, is Italian. She's from northern Rome, but they now live in Rome. So it was nice to be able to visit them and go out for dinner, where we had some really good food and wine. This is a very simple caprese salad with some roasted peppers and eggplants. Caprese is one of the easiest things to make. You can make it yourself, but the key is the ingredients. Fresh mozzarella, fresh basil, really good fresh tomatoes, and a little bit of olive oil and maybe some vinegar. That's all it takes. And if the ingredients are good, it's one of the best things to eat. Um, so I will end the program there. We're just about at time. And I'm going to stop my share. And if anyone has any questions, I would welcome you to unmute yourself and chime in. You put them in the chat or just unmute and wave and say hi. You know what I will also do? I'm going to put in the chat my email. I find sometimes that people are shy, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. That's my email address. So if you have any questions about Rome, Italy, travel, I like to chat with people, so feel free to contact me with any other questions you might have. I'm not necessarily an expert, but I'll answer them if I can. I'm a librarian, so if I don't know the answer, I know where to look. Does anybody have any questions? Very quiet group tonight.
Jeff, this is Mary Ann. Where are you going next? Because
Where am I going?
I look forward to seeing.
Where am I going in a program, or where am I going?
No, not with the program. Next in your travel.
In real life?
Yes, in real life.
This winter, I spent a week in the Yucatan, no, 10 days in Yucatan in Mexico looking at Mayan ruins. So I have a program on that, actually. And I went just was it end of January or was it in early February? I spent a week in Panama, which was very interesting. Last weekend, we went to Portsmouth just to get away for the weekend, which I don't always travel to just exotic places. Sometimes it's nice to explore all the amazing things that we have very close by. My next trip is in about 4 weeks, actually 4 weeks from tomorrow. We're leaving for Greece. I have a house in Greece, actually, see it behind me. My father's family is from Greece. So I've traveled there quite a bit and tried to go there at least maybe 3 times a year. So we're going to go for Easter and go with some friends and spend some time in the village and spend some time traveling around. So that's the only travel plan I have at this point. I have a long list of places on my wish list. So hopefully I'll get to some other places later this year. But if Danvers is interested, the Yucatan and Panama programs are the most recent ones that I've put together. I also have one on Cartagena in Colombia, where I went last year also. For some reason, I guess I was just needing to be warm. So I haven't traveled as much in Central and South America as I would like. So I did a few trips down there. So I'm always happy to do those. If you are interested in my programs, follow me on Instagram because I usually post any upcoming programs there. Uh, and they're most of the time they're on Zoom. A couple of them for nearby libraries are in-person programs, but most of them are on Zoom, so it doesn't matter where you are.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Jeff before we end for tonight?
I want to ask one more question, please.
Sure.
Jeff, you're well seasoned in traveling, and what would you suggest to somebody or a group of people who are not as well traveled? Use a travel agent, go on their own. How would you suggest planning for the best use of a person or group's time?
Are you talking about Italy in particular, or
No,
the
anywhere.
whole
I
world?
think I
Anywhere.
think anywhere. I think
I
anywhere. I
I
think.
think the
I
most
think.
important thing that I think I could suggest to you is to ask yourself a bunch of questions first. I do most of my travel planning by myself. I haven't used a travel agent in years, although I have a good friend who is a travel agent, but I do all my own stuff. And I'm not a big fan of tours, which is not to say there's anything wrong with them. It's just not the way I like to travel. So I think what you should do if you are thinking whether you're going by yourself or definitely if you're going with a group is try to get a sense of what is important to people. Are you interested in history? Are you interested in shopping? Do you have people with mobility issues? Do you have, there are all those kinds of things that are like, what are you trying to get out of your travel experience? Are you hoping to explore and see architecture and see cities and meet people or have experiences? Or are you just looking to kind of sit and relax? You could go to Italy and like rent a car and drive all over the place and do all kinds of adventures. Or you could rent a villa in Tuscany and sit like a lump by the pool and drink limoncello. It depends entirely on what you enjoy doing when you travel or what you hope to enjoy. Um, if you're going with a group, a tour can be a good way to just not deal with stuff. um, if you're not a seasoned traveler, a tour can just be a good way to have somebody else take care of everything. If anything goes wrong, somebody's responsible. If you need to make it to someplace on time, somebody's going to be in charge of that. If there's tickets to worry about, if there's language issues to worry about, it's somebody else's problem. And so, in that respect, I think a tour can be a good idea um, if you are that kind of traveler. But it really depends. So I think what you need to do is uh, ask yourself a bunch of questions first, and then think about what matters to you and the people you're going to be traveling with. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Travel is there's no one way to travel. It's everybody's different, everybody's unique, even couples traveling together. I have some very good friends that I've traveled with and discovered that, oh, yeah, they're one of my best friends, but I could kill them if we travel together. We're just not traveling. We can't travel together. It's a different way of being with people. So um, I love traveling alone, in fact, because um, I don't mind my own company, not all the time, and not for weeks and weeks, but I'm perfectly happy to find a nice place, sit with a book, explore a city, and not be beholden to what anybody else wants to do. There's something to be said for that too. A big thing I know a lot of people worry about is language. And that I think is something that probably isn't, if it worries you, don't let it, because particularly for the kinds of places that many people travel to now, English is so widely spoken in the tour industry all over the world. If you go to Rome, Yes, you want to learn a few basic Italian phrases like hello, goodbye, please, thank you, where's the bar, and things like that. But everybody speaks a little. If a hotel, a museum, a restaurant, they're all going to speak at least a little bit of English. It's polite to try and respectful to kind of meet people halfway, but don't let language a lack of knowing the language intimidate you from visiting a place, because it really isn't that big a problem. But
Thank,
again, if you
thank
have
you.
any particular questions, feel free to email me because if there's specific places you're interested in or things that you're wondering about.
Anybody else before we end? Any other questions?
Well, thanks for joining me. I hope I'll see you guys again at some other program.
Thank you so much, Jeff. You did
I'm trying to think
excellent.
of, while I've got you, I could probably tell you when the next one is. Whoops, I think I just closed the wrong thing. My next one is next week. I am doing a program on Zoom on Norway. The following week, 2 weeks later, I'm actually doing the Panama and Yucatan programs that I mentioned. I'm going to be doing in April. And again, if you follow me on Instagram, I post the information and the links there. So that's one way to find out about it. But otherwise, again, thank you for joining me, and I hope I'll see you. Thanks to Danvers for having me, and I hope I'll see
You're
you
welcome,
guys.
Jeff. Thank you again for coming tonight. And this presentation will be is recorded, and I'll have this up on social media just in case anyone missed the beginning of it that joined us later on. Thank you all again, and have a great night. We hope to see
Thanks,
you soon,
everybody.
Jeff. Take
Good
care.
night.
Bye-bye.